Unconventional and innovative, Nicholas Simmons is a breath of fresh air to water media techniques. In this workshop, the 2007 National Watercolor Society top prize winner works large scale and reveals how challenges unique to water media can be turned to an artist's advantage with stunning results. He incorporates blooming, crawlbacks, bleeding, and puddling, and demonstrates methods for integrating massed areas with wet-into-wet painting. Nick mixes watercolor with fluid acrylics, encourages the paper to buckle, and boldly wields a spray bottle to achieve textural effects. This approach is perfect for artists striving to achieve a looser look while maintaining control of the final painting. Now let's join Nicholas Simmons in innovative water media.
Hello and welcome. I'm Nicholas Simmons, but you can call me Nick. And in this DVD, I'm going to explain quite a bit about my process in creating a painting. I use standard watercolor paint and also acrylic paint. I've used most of the brands out there, and in watercolor I've settled primarily on Daniel Smith and Da Vinci. I keep them in this Dick Blick plastic palette. I don't talk much about which colors I use because I buy and use whatever I like without regard to any certain arrangement or palette. I've never referred to a color wheel. I know even less about colors technically, and if I have questions about any of this, I refer to the Bible of watercolor information, handprint.com. I use the acrylic paint in a watercolor style. I mix it in this metal butcher's tray, which is starting to get a little bit beat up and a little chipped. Acrylic paint, unlike watercolor, doesn't move when subjected to subsequent washes, glazes, or re-wetting. This can be an advantage, but also a disadvantage if you're into lifting techniques. I absolutely love the fluid acrylics, especially those made by Golden. The consistency is even more luxurious than watercolor and mixes really easily. They're also less expensive than watercolor, which is certainly a consideration, especially when you're working large. I do want to stress that I can pretty much do anything in watercolor that I can do in acrylic and vice versa. I choose one or the other for convenience or my mood, or sometimes just based on whichever palette is cleaner. Most important, when thinned with water and used in a transparent watercolor fashion, there is no difference that I can detect between the two. I can't even tell in my own paintings when or where I've used watercolor or acrylic unless there's some color that's only available in one or the other. One caution about acrylic paint is that I use the same brushes as I do with my watercolors. And the brushes have to be washed out thoroughly with soap and water or you'll ruin them. And I've ruined many brushes forgetting to do that. So here's one of those big cheap house painters that's great for wetting paper and even moving around washes on a large scale. Here's my favorite wash brush with the crazy bristles. Here's a decent white sable synthetic that's had a lot of use, 2-inch brush, one of my most useful sizes. The bristles of a quality brush are so fine and so dense, they mash the pigment down into the paper and inhibit a lot of action in the paint. A 1.5 red sable synthetic. I like this mop brush for wetting paper when I don't want to disturb anything. It's really soft. Another one of these great house painters. This one's really pathetic, but I tell you, it's one of my prized possessions. And then an assortment of various rounds. This is a number 14, number 6. Some of these little tiny ones for detail. And of course, the toothbrush. And I get these every 6 months when I go to the dentist. For masking fluid work, I just go to the art stores and buy these little bags. They're usually about $5 and you get 10 brushes in a variety of sizes. The masking fluid really ruins brushes quickly, so I don't like to use any of my others for that. I go through these pretty quickly, but I figure they're worth it. They're pretty cheap. I make great use of the spray bottle for wetting the paper without touching it, creating texture, and for washing away paint. It's essential to have the kind with the adjustable nozzle so you can get either the fine mist or the more concentrated, stronger stream of water. I also use masking fluid and a hair dryer. The masking fluid is whatever's on sale at the time. And for removing the masking fluid, what I use is a whole bunch of old masking fluid. Looks pretty disgusting, but it works. The hair dryer, I would be lost without. It saves me a lot of time. I usually buy most of my paper in rolls, either Arches or Fabriano, and it's usually either 44 inches wide or 52 inches wide and 140 pound or 156 pound. This happens to be the Arches. It's 52 inches wide by 10 yards long, and it's the 156 pound, which I like. It's about 10% heavier, and it makes managing the large sheets a lot easier. I've never stretched paper in my life. It's never really seemed necessary, and heavy paper and stretching or attaching it to a watercolor board inhibits some of the techniques I like to use. If the paper buckles, I just mist the back and put it under a piece of heavy glass to flatten it. Sometimes I coat the paper with gesso, normally a really thin wash. The resulting surface encourages more action with the paint and also provides some directional texture depending on how it's brushed on. It also makes a fantastic surface to draw on. First thing to do is to weight down the free end, just using these blocks of wood, and then unroll it and spray the paper so that it will start to relax. Doesn't take too much. I then stick a couple more blocks here so it won't roll back up, and I'll wait a few minutes. So 5 minutes later, we're in business. Beautiful. So the next thing I do is measure it, and I think I'm going to make this 40 inches square. And I'll start over here. And the paper's so wide, I actually have to do this again in the middle. And then I need a straight edge to draw a line across here. It doesn't have to be precisely square, but I'd like to get it close. And then it's just a matter of cutting. My other tool is the digital projector, and I'll be talking about that next. Using the projector is the best and easiest way I know of to transfer the drawing onto a large piece of paper. It takes a little while to get all the stuff squared up, but most projectors have features that allow you to adjust that. And I center it in my paper and tack the paper to the wall. Digital projectors pixelate the image so that smooth lines actually end up having a little bit of a stair-step effect. So it's not as easy as just tracing, because while you're doing it, you have to make a lot of little decisions about what to do with a line. Sometimes I make decisions about leaving things out or adding things, making various types of adjustments. So I'm going to start at the top here. I'm really doing what's essentially a contour drawing here. I'm just worried about the outside edges. I'm not really going to do any detail whatsoever. These bamboo leaves are going to be negatively painted anyway. And since I'm going to rely on watercolor to add a lot of textural interest and detail, all I really need is the outline. I'm very careful in my studio to keep the projector in the same place and not disturb it. Anybody who's used really any type of projector, particularly the opaque type projectors or the prism projectors, knows that it's pretty much impossible to place a picture inside one of those things the same way twice. So if you move it, you're in trouble. While I'm doing this, of course, I'm usually making the mistake of trying to visualize how the painting's going to look, and nothing turns out the way you think it's going to. It's really best to take on sort of a detached attitude while you do this, and just forget about what you're doing. I usually put on some music. I checked this a few minutes ago with the lights on. I didn't miss anything, and that was the last of it, so I believe we've got it. I've got the drawing done, and I'm happy with it. You'll see that I masked off the edges with masking tape. It will encourage the paper to buckle. When the paper gets wet, it'll expand at a different rate than the masking tape, which basically doesn't do anything. So having these edges masked will encourage some weird things to happen with the paper, and that'll let the paint sort of undulate and settle and pool up and puddle up in various areas. And since I'm doing a water-themed painting, I want stuff like that to happen. I'm going to do the background first. So I'm going to mask out all the bamboo stuff. I'm going to mask out all the fish. So all that's going to be left are these background areas. It really helps with the masking fluid to fill up a little jar with dishwashing liquid. And I regularly dump my brush in there and clean it off because the dishwashing liquid seems to help keep the masking fluid from building up on the bristles of this brush. I also run it over the bar of soap, and that seems to sort of scrub some of the masking fluid off. So between the dishwashing liquid and the bar of soap, I can make this little brush go pretty far before it's trashed. I'm going to begin by running a little bead of masking fluid along the edge of the masking tape so that I don't get any paint seeping under there and ruining my beautiful white border. I've done the edges around the perimeter here, and I'm going to start in on the fish. I'm going to use a bigger brush for that. How annoying is this? This brush doesn't fit into my little bottle of masking fluid, so I'm going to take a pair of pliers here. You probably don't want to do this with your $300 Kolinsky, but again, that brush is worth about 50 cents, so beautiful. It doesn't seem to affect the performance of the masking fluid if some of this soapy water is mixed with it, and it actually thins it a little bit and makes it easier to apply. It really does simplify things later on, and it's really the only way to get the sort of texture I want for the background. Painting around objects leaves a different type of brush stroke than actually painting the objects themselves. And for the water, and that's what I envisioned for the background, I want something different. When a painter has used masking fluid, you can usually tell. Part of that is when some of these little corners and these little points start getting blunted. You need a pretty small brush to get the detail just right. I've got some techniques to obscure the fact because I just don't really want anybody to know that I've used it. I'm going to spatter some masking fluid around the painting so that I'll be able to preserve some little dots of white. Once the painting's done and all the masking's off and I'm pretty much at the end, I'll uncover those little dots of masking fluid. If the painting has gotten too dark or too dense, it tends to let the painting start to breathe a little bit. It brings back some of the whites of the paper, and if I like them, I keep them. If I don't like them, they're very easy to paint out. Since my tendency, if I screw things up, is usually to go too dark, this ensures that I'll always have a little brightness and some white paper showing through. I just do this with really any brush, but I'm going to use this pretty small one here. And I don't want to overdo it. It's very easy to get carried away with it because it's kind of fun. And I found this is a pretty good idea with almost any type of painting and any subject matter. And it's something you have to do now. And I don't cover the whole page. I don't cover all these areas. I want a few areas where there's nothing happening. And another thing you'll see later on is that if you've got a big area that becomes sort of dull or muddy, it's amazing how these little white dots will distract the eye from that, and you'll lock in on those, and it can really brighten one of those dull passages. I'm going to do the pour on damp paper. It's not going to be sopping wet because I'm going to be doing a lot of spraying. I'm going to be adding a lot of water to the surface. So I don't really want it dripping wet to begin with, but I definitely want it damp, and that way the pour will diffuse a little bit. And it gives me more room for error, more margin for error. So it's really sort of another safety mechanism that I've learned to incorporate over the years after a lot of failures and a lot of just kind of winging it. And again, I work the water into the paper so it's not just sitting on top of the sizing. And then I watch it for a few minutes until it gets just to the right point, which is wet, damp, not too wet, not too dry. It's not an exact science. Some areas will start to dry out faster than the others. At home in my studio, I've got some lights set up that get pretty hot, and sometimes I move the painting around so they don't start concentrating on one part. So I'll watch this for a few minutes and then go when it's the right time. I dumped out some raw sienna here. I actually used another brand, not Golden, because I don't think they offer raw sienna yet. And I also dumped out some phthalo blue, which was also another brand because I think Golden has phthalo blue in a green shade and a red shade, and I want just a straight phthalo blue. I'm going to mix it up in these little plastic cups, and these are just detergent cups. And again, I use the spray bottle. And the spray bottle, of course, breaks down the paint. Get into a nice, juicy mixture. I like raw sienna and phthalo blue as a combination for water stuff. It's a terrific color. I found that raw sienna mixes with just about anything beautifully anyway. But I'm not going to mix them together in the cup. I'm going to let that happen on the paper. Because mixing on the paper ends up looking a lot more interesting than mixing it together on the palette. If I mix them together on the palette, then all the excitement's gone. It's mixed, it makes some other color, sort of a green. And if I let them mix on the paper, then you're going to see some phthalo blue, you're going to see some raw sienna, and then you're going to see the combination of the two. That appeals to me quite a bit more. I'm going to start sort of in the middle of the paper and then let it sort of flow off towards the top. And this is probably the main reason I don't like really heavy paper, and I don't like to attach paper to a board because I can't manipulate it then. And while this is a little bit scary for some people, if you keep the spray bottle close by, and if you keep things wet, nothing too terrible can happen, usually. And sometimes this is a well-orchestrated symphony. Sometimes it's a bit of a war. It's actually almost always a combination of the two. And I don't really want even coverage. I want some places to have a little bit more than others. You also have to not care about getting your studio messy, but I'm always suspicious of artists with clean studios. I really enjoy this part. It's kind of the part that's relaxing and even a little hypnotic, maybe therapeutic. And again, giving up some of that control and letting the paint do a little bit what it wants to really adds to the spontaneity of the thing. You can see already the paper is starting to buckle somewhat, and I like that. There was a time when that kind of stuff used to drive me nuts. In fact, enough so that I might even abandon the painting and start over. And then I finally got it through my head to sort of embrace those things, and instead of freaking out about them, just let them happen. And in fact, all this weird stuff that happens between the paint and the paper are precisely the types of things that really scream watercolor. And they're the types of effects, or defects, I suppose, depending on your point of view, that really look wet. And that's what I want in my watercolors. I want them to look wet. Some of these drips that went across here and left these lines, I love those. I want to keep those. I take a very relaxed, detached attitude at this point, because as most of us have learned, the picture you have in your head of how the painting is going to go is pretty rarely the way it ends up happening when it comes right down to it. So you might as well toss out all those expectations and ideas and let the paint do a little bit what it wants to, and then you just roll with the punches. Okay, I'm happy with the raw sienna layer. This is a medium viscosity acrylic, which I don't like as much, so I'm really hoping I can start obtaining these two colors in fluid acrylic. But it's not a big deal. It just takes a little more work to break them down. And I'm going to pour this more along the bottom part of the painting. I want to get some of it mixing in with the raw sienna. And if it doesn't cover all the spots of the paper, then I just encourage it a little bit with a brush, but lightly, because I don't really want any brush strokes here. That's sort of the whole point of doing the pour. I always end up with a lot of extra paint here, so I'm going to pour some of this off. Probably more paint ends up in the bucket than on the painting, but that's how it goes. I don't really want this happening up here, so I start spraying that to diffuse it. There's really no way to get this effect that I know of other than pouring the paint. So I mix up the Quin Gold, and I still call it Quin Gold because I just don't want to say nickel azo gold. Make sure we're plenty wet up here. It's really a bit more than I wanted, so I'll be spraying a lot of this off. That's okay. The paint is always better at mixing itself than I am at mixing it. So, let it do its thing. I like what it's done down here. We've got a little more of a turquoise thing going on instead of a straight phthalo blue. I'm not really keen on colors that you can identify right off the bat, but I'm going to be doing another layer over this, so even if there's something I don't like about one of these shades here, I know I can change that in a subsequent pour or wash. Don't necessarily have to do it as a pour. Once I've established this background, I can go back in with a brush, but I would like to get it as close as possible in this stage here. Maybe a little bluer than I like over here, so I'm going to tone that down maybe a little bit. Actually, I think I'll do this with raw sienna. And as you can see, I'm not too careful about it. If you get too careful in one part of the painting, then I always get the feeling like the whole thing has to look that way. A little bit of sloppiness never hurt anybody. I think I want to get a little more blue going up in this direction, and a little more right in there. You hit it with the spray bottle. As you can see, the spray bottle is sort of my best friend. Sometimes it's more useful than a brush. Now the thing to do is to watch it for a while and see if it begins to do anything bizarre. Well, as I said, I've probably missed a couple of minute areas with the masking fluid. If I dump some paint on there and it doesn't sit there for very long, it probably won't do anything too bad. But if I've got a concentrated area of some paint, some of these darker splotches, if that just happens to be sitting on a piece of bare paper, well, I don't want that. So I'll mop some of this up. But I would kind of like that to be a little bluer than green, so maybe the thing to do would be to soak up some of this green in here. That looks better to me. It's very tempting when you do this tipping of the paper. It's so much fun, and it's so cool to see all the colors mix around that you want to just sit there and do it all day. And I've made that mistake many times. What happens is all the paint that's on the paper just mixes together, and then you just got one color. And lots of times it ends up being a muddy color, so you have to stop yourself. I think less ends up being more on that. You can see the paper is starting to buckle here, and the paint is pooling, and that's exactly what I want. I just want to put a few accents around the painting, and I don't really want them to look like brush strokes. So I'll spray those a little bit, and I kind of feel like there should be something over on this side, something down here. This is another thing that's very easy to overdo because it looks so good when you're doing it when the paper's wet that you want to keep going, but probably better to err on the side of not quite as much as you'd like to do rather than too much. Blooms or blossoms, crawlbacks, whatever you want to call them. And this is something typically that a lot of watercolors try to avoid, but I encourage them because I think it looks good. It adds a lot of texture to the painting. And again, it's one of those things that is so unique to watercolor that from across a gallery, it just screams watercolor. And that's what I want. I want something that looks really wet. It won't really take in the areas where the paint is puddled, but in these little hill areas where the paint is drier, it's just about right. You know, it's still kind of damp, whereas if I drop in some clear water, it'll start creating a lot of those blossoms. As far as I'm concerned, the more the merrier. Another thing about encouraging these and sort of embracing the look is that if you avoid them, and one of them happens, then it looks like a mistake. But if you encourage them to happen, then it becomes a technique. But I'll admit that when I started out, I thought everything had to be perfect. I thought washes had to be perfect. I thought everything had to be uniform. And it's probably a good thing in the beginning, at least, to practice perfect uniform washes because it's nice to be able to do that when you want to do that. But I can't tell you how many paintings I destroyed or abandoned because some little thing like this cropped up and I thought that it was ruining it. You look at this and you can tell that water did that. I like the sort of organic looking patterns that it creates, and I think it really enhances the painting. Of course, we've added a lot of water to the painting now, so it's going to take longer for it to dry through this next stage. But actually, I'm not even going to wait for it to dry completely. I want to preserve some of those, but I want some of the other areas, the little hills, to dry, but I want some of the little valleys where the puddles have collected. I want those to stay wet, because in the next stage what I'll be doing is washing some of that away, and that'll create a whole nother type of pattern, one that I think really looks cool in these types of paintings. Most of the painting is dry, except in these areas where the paint puddled up and collected. I'm going to wash that paint away, and it ends up creating a really cool looking organic texture that some people think looks similar to batik. So I even started calling this batik watercolor. I'm going to hold this up. But you'll see this area where paint had collected earlier and it was pretty dark. Now it's quite a bit lighter because I've washed that paint away. And it's just another way of creating more natural looking, organic looking textures that look like they happened as the result of water and not a person wielding a brush. One thing that happens with the paint is it tends to dry first around the edges. And it's done it really nice here. I love this, how it's a little bit darker around the edges of the fish and it kind of highlights that and it washes away as you get away from these masked areas. If you've done it while the paper is too wet and you've washed away too much paint, that's really not a disaster because you can go right back, add another layer of paint, do the same process again. So it's probably best, especially if you're using acrylic watercolor, to err on the side of washing away a little bit too much paint. If things get too dry, you're kind of stuck with what you've got with acrylic watercolor. I've noticed that I missed a little area with the masking fluid, but it's not a big emergency. Since these bamboo leaves are going to be green, and this is sort of a bluish green to begin with, it's not going to be a big deal, but I'm going to be doing another layer of color here, and I don't want it to get any darker than that, so I'm just going to mask quickly that little area that I missed. I'm going to go through this process again. I'm going to do another layer of color. The color I'm going to use is one of my favorite blues, which is ultramarine blue, mixed with a little bit of dioxazine purple. And the combination of these two really makes what I think of as a cobalt blue, really more so than the cobalt blue that you buy. And this color is critical enough for me where I want to get it just right. I don't want it to be too blue, I don't want it to be too purple. And of course the dioxazine purple is a pretty intense color and it can take over very quickly. So if it's going too much in one direction, too blue or too purple, that's no problem. I can spray some of it away and make adjustments. As long as the painting is wet, I can pretty much do as I please. I could pour the paint again, but I think I'll just brush this, and I might do a little more tilting, but I'm going to go with the brush for a moment. You can see how much more blue I need than the purple. That purple is such a powerful color. It's looking a little bit too purple to me on the paper, so I'm going to go with a little more ultramarine. Of course, the color that's below there is having a big effect on it also. I'd really love to have one of those colors where you can't really tell if it's blue or if it's purple. I want to tie the whole painting together, so some of the stuff that happens down here color-wise, I want to introduce some of that up here. So you see I'm just letting it run back off there. I guess the idea is that the water is deeper down here. We're looking sort of into the depths here. And near the top, we've got some sunlight coming through. And I really don't have any idea whether we're underwater or looking into the water. I don't really know if the bamboo is above the water and we're looking down, or if it's under the water, but I really don't care. It's really just the design of the piece that matters to me. We've got some areas that still have some of the phthalo. I want to preserve some of that, so I'll blot areas where I want some of that underlying color. The Quin gold that was down here, I'm going to blot there because I don't want to lose that. And we've got some of the yellow and some of the raw sienna look up there, some more green. So we've got a pretty nice variation of color here without it being too colorful, because I hate what I think of as the dreaded lollipop effect. I don't like that look where it's just like every color on the palette and it looks like a big bowl of candy. I'm not into that. And besides, the real stars of the show here are supposed to be the koi fish. So they are going to be the things that have the really intense color. And this background, we want it to be interesting but not too colorful. I don't want it to compete with the fish. And we're also going to have some greens happening in the bamboo. I'm going to let this sit for a while, then I'll drop some clear water in there, hopefully to get a little action going with this layer of paint. It's to the point where I want to drop in some more clear water to try and create as many watercolor no-nos as possible, more blooms, blossoms, and crawlbacks. They won't be as evident in this layer because there's a layer of paint underneath, and you can never get that same kind of effect at this stage as you can over pure white paper. But as long as it gets a little bit of something going, that should do it. You can't do this all day, of course, because then the paper gets too wet and nothing happens, all the water converges, and then you've lost everything that you've just created. I think that'll do it for this stage, and we'll try and figure out what to do next. I said that I was going to do this washing away process again with the second layer, but I've decided not to. I kind of like it the way it is, and there's really no set rules in this process. You can do this stuff as much or as little as you like. And I'm pretty pleased with how it came out. I like the direction of the way the little lines and undulations came out. It gives the thing a nice direction this way. Really, if I can keep from putting down more layers of paint, I like to do that because the more paint you get in there, the duller things can get or the denser they get. I've said before that it's my tendency usually to go a little bit too dark if I screw something up. And I haven't done that, so I don't want to screw it up. So I'm pretty pleased with it. And to quote my friend Arnold Lowry, it's my painting. I can do as I like. I'm going to try and create some diagonal runs and drips across here, so I'm going to hold the paper up and load up this brush and just start doing things like this. I'm going to do it several times because I don't expect to use every one of these runs. I'll pick the ones that I like if I like what happened. I can introduce a little paint in there. I've mixed up some raw umber and ultramarine blue, just to make kind of a brownish gray tone, and nothing too dark. And I'll start dropping it into some of these runs. Actually, I'm going to get a little daring here, and I'm just going to do it with the paint. And of course, as long as things are wet, I can't get into too much trouble. I can wipe them off or spray them off if they do something I don't like. It's funny how things will run and drip beautifully when you don't want them to, and how difficult it is to get them to do that when you do want them to. And I like how some of them converged here and came together and made that little shape. I sort of like that, so I'm going to keep it. I want to add a little more to this one. I definitely want to get some of them going across these bamboo leaves. That creates some interest. Actually, trying to paint these kind of things yourself with a brush never looks as natural as when the water does it on its own. And I think I like that pretty well. I'll check this out for a few minutes. If I decide I need a little bit more through here, I'll do that, but I'm going to let it sit for a minute. This one sort of came straight into this bamboo leaf and echoed this direction in a way that I wasn't crazy about. So I painted this one. I had it come back out and up across this way, so there was some continuity there, and also changed the direction, the angle of that. But I'm still not crazy about how this comes into almost the point of that leaf, but that'll be obscured a little bit in a couple of the next steps, so I'm not really worried about it. I added another one up here. I felt like something had to happen up there. As I say, I actually painted these. I've got more confidence about doing that once the natural ones, the ones that happened on their own, once they've sort of established a size and a direction and sort of a feel, then I feel I can add a few on my own and hopefully sort of keep them in the same character as the ones that happen naturally. So I painted this one, and one reason I painted it myself was I wanted to get this little jog in here, this little bend. I like a lot of the sumie type of painting and Chinese brush techniques, and I practice a lot of that stuff. I wanted to make sure that it just didn't come out on the other side of the fish in the opposite place, so I had it come out here. If everything just enters one side of an object and comes out directly on the opposite side, it's just sort of boring for the eye. There was a big shape where the drips and runs converged here, and I liked that, but it was a little bit too dark, and it was also right dead center in the middle of the painting. And I don't really like stuff like that. I don't like things that are centered exactly. I don't like coincidences in paintings. They don't seem believable to me. If anything weird happens in a reference photograph, 2 points coming together, some of these tangent things, maybe objects coming close together and kissing, as some people say, I make sure and get rid of all that stuff because it just doesn't look right to me in a painting. I'm trying to get just the right mixture where it's, I don't know, somewhere in the middle, which I know doesn't really tell you a whole lot, but maybe when you see it happening on the paper, that'll give you some indication. And I use this big brush to make sure that the paper is pretty evenly wet or damp. And I start out sort of in areas like this where it's already dark. I like to do this first in the little corners and the little nooks and crannies. And when I remove the masking fluid, it's going to make it look as though this sort of happened naturally when I painted the bamboo. And again, I like to concentrate in these little V's and these little nooks, these little corners, because it seems to be the most natural place to have some of this dark color radiating outwards. And I'm not going to do it everywhere. Just do it in enough places to create hopefully a natural effect. Ideally, in my own studio, I would then maybe get to about here and actually toss the painting on the floor and get away from it and check it out to make sure I'm not going too far or too dark or too much. And as the paper begins to dry out, I just hit it again with the sprayer. This is exactly what I want it to do. I want it to be a little bit darker right next to the edge, and I want it to fade out into this middle section, but I don't want it to cover the whole middle section because I don't want to dull down this color that I put down in those first layers. So it's really doing just about what I want. It's a little bit too dark there, so blot some of that. It's easy to take care of. Of course, I don't want to go too dark up in this area because that'll really look unnatural, being lighter shade to begin with. I need to go darker down in these areas. And if the paint's too wet or the paper's too wet and it starts to fill in one of these little areas, I just blot it out. I don't really want to spray anything out too much because that's just going to get the paper too wet. And as I say, all this stuff will start spreading together and converging. I'm going to turn the painting around and start the same process over in this other corner. Some people ask me about how long it's safe to keep masking fluid on the paper. I've never really had a problem with it. I use mostly hot press paper, and it's smooth enough so that the masking fluid doesn't really grab down there into the surface the way it would on rough paper. I know on rough paper you can have some problems removing it, but I've had masking fluid on paper for up to months at a time and had no trouble pulling it off. Even with the cold press, which is of course a little bit rougher than the hot press. All right, that's probably enough in this area. I don't want to go too far with it, so I'm going to turn the painting again and get going on this last section of bamboo. What I use to remove masking fluid is masking fluid. So I've got this big disgusting looking blob, but it does the job. Nothing complicated about this except that when I get close to the edges where the masking tape is, I want to go along the line this way so I don't start peeling the masking tape back. So I'll move this way. And of course, you might remember I also put a little bead of masking fluid along the edge to keep paint from leaking under the tape. And I'm going to lose some of that, so when I get done with this part, I will paint another bead of masking fluid along there. The paper has to be really dry when you do this. I probably should have said that to start out with. If it's wet at all, you can start pulling up the paper with it. So I really spent some time with the hair dryer on this, and I also turned the paper over and hit the hair dryer from that side just to make sure that it's as dry as possible. I don't do this too carefully. I'm not too reverent about it. I just go for it. In fact, I'm trying not to do anything too super careful because I think there should be a consistency in the handling of the work. So if you're going to do a lot of it carefully, it kind of feels like the whole thing has to be careful. And if you're going to do some of it loose, or at least make it look as though it was loose, then I think the whole painting has to sort of be consistent with that. So I'm going to do that on all the bamboo areas, get all this masking fluid off. I've got the masking done around the bamboo, and I've just squeezed out some golden fluid green gold, which is pretty bright paint. And I generally like to go brighter with colors in the beginning stages of a painting anyway, because if they're too bright or gaudy, I can always mute them, I can always dull them down, but it's almost impossible to go the other way. So again, it's sort of another little safety device I use. Go a little brighter with the colors than you actually intend. And then I thought, just to mix things up here a little bit, I'm going to use some regular watercolor, some raw sienna, just to demonstrate that you can mix the two together. And when you mix a regular watercolor with the acrylic, it makes the watercolor an acrylic itself, makes it permanent. But most of this layer is going to be green. You can see this green gold is really yellow-green stuff. A little bit of the raw sienna going here, touch of the phthalo blue, a little bit of the hookers, a little bit of the quin gold, and what the heck, I think I'll use a little bit of phthalo green also. Phthalo green is a dangerous color because it spreads like a wildfire, and trying to control it is like trying to stop a runaway train. So I'm really careful when I use it. But the phthalo colors add some electricity to the painting, and they're good for doing bottom layers because even if you paint on top of them, they still come through pretty strong. Remember, I've used enough masking fluid around the edges so that I can be a little bit sloppy and not worry too much. Of course, in these interior areas, mask those completely. And of course, at this point, this green gold is pretty garish. I mean, it looks fluorescent. It's not going to end up that way in the end, but as a first layer, it's nice to get these super bright colors down first. So to make that disperse a little bit, hit it with the spray bottle. And you see that when I've introduced another color somewhere, let's say like this raw sienna, I'll try and carry that over into another leaf over here so that there's some continuity in the color changes. This is something that would be very difficult to do if I painted these directly without the masking fluid. Because if I had to get down here with a little brush and paint all these things slowly, and I put a little, raw sienna here, and then when I get over to this leaf, try and put a little raw sienna in there, it's not going to have the same consistent flow and look and texture that I got over here. But doing it this way with the masking fluid and letting everything flow together here, it sort of brings everything together. That's why I've used the masking fluid for this stage. Most of these colors here are straight watercolor, but they've been mixing with the acrylic and therefore essentially become acrylic. And then I want to put just a little bit of this quin gold in here. I had this quin gold accent in the background here, so that to me would be a logical place to put a touch of it in the leaf. I had some of it over here. So if I've got some of the Quinn gold in the background and I've got some of it in the leaves, I think that makes sort of a logical combination there. And then what I'm going to do is wait for this to get about 3/4 of the way dry, and I'm going to start dropping clear water in there to get a bunch of those blooms and blossoms so I get some texture in here. I could do the dryer at this stage, and I probably will do that to speed it up, because I'm not really worried so much about pushing the paint around in here the way I was in the background. In the background, I wanted to preserve all those big shapes that the blooms and the crawlbacks were creating. In these little tighter spaces, I feel like I've got more freedom. If I push the pigment around a little bit, it's not really a big deal. I've been watching this for about 15 minutes, and overall I would say it's about 75% dry, or getting there. Not completely dry. When I say 75% dry, I don't mean that 75% of it is dry and 25% of it is wet. What I mean is all of it is still wet, but it's almost dry. That's where the paper will accept this water and start creating the blooms and the crawlbacks. And that's something that, if you like the effect, it's something worth practicing in your studio just on scrap paper, because it all comes down to how damp the paper is, especially with the acrylic paint. If watercolor has dried on you, you can reactivate it, of course, by dropping some water back into it, and you can probably create some of these effects even after it's dried. But with the acrylic, once it's dry, you're sort of stuck with it. So I got to let that do its thing for a while. While that big section is drying, I'm going to go ahead and start on these areas. Even it out with the big Home Depot brush. More green gold, some raw sienna. And I introduced a little bit of phthalo blue in the other one, so I'll do the same thing here. Get some of the Hooker's green in there, a little bit of the Quinn gold, or nickel azo gold. For this so-called natural effect, I want to get something going across some of these leaves, which again is something that would be very difficult to do convincingly with a normal painting technique. So some of this Hooker's was over here, and it comes across these other leaves here, and painting that in a normal way would be hard to do. So I'm going to let this sit for a few minutes. I'll probably use the hair dryer on it to speed things up, and when it gets to that perfect stage again, I'll drop some clear water in there to get some action going with the paint. Just about dry. It's not completely dry. I got some nice action going with it, and now you can see why I used some Hooker's green in there, because it's the Hooker's green that responds best to that, and it does a lot of sort of screwy things that I like that add a lot of texture and interest to the leaves. I want to do the process of spraying away some paint, the thing that I did in the first layer of the background, because that just creates some additional texture, a different type of texture. Most of this is dry, so most of it will stay, but some of it is still pretty wet, so it'll go away, but it'll leave behind some interesting sort of organic looking patterns, and I am going to be doing another layer of paint on top of this anyway, so if it gets too washed away, I can always go back into it. For instance, right here you can see what's happened. That part that was wet got washed away, and it really accentuated the edge of that bloom there, and I like that. And as long as I keep the paper wet over here, it's not really going to stain any of that too badly. Oh, you can see here it did some really nice things. I like that. Again, it sort of achieves some of that so-called batik look, because the paint seems to stick around the edges, which is something that you see in batik fabric. Once in a while when I do this, some of these paint runs and drips that go across the painting look good to me, so I keep them. But I think here I'll just blot some of that up. I see I dripped a little bit of green paint there earlier. I didn't know I did that, but here it looks actually pretty good to me. You'll see a lot of that super bright color that I had, that green gold, some of that washed away, so it's not nearly as loud and gaudy as it started out, but we're also down to almost pure paper in a few places, so I want to get a little more color in there. So I want the bamboo to be green, but I don't want it to be too green. I want to have a little brown in there. I want to have some earth tones in there, but not too much of that because I don't want it to get dull. So just sort of wing it at this point. I sort of like how it fades into nothing up here. It looks like it's sort of negatively painted, so I'll probably preserve some of that. I don't want to cover all of it. I just want to get a little bit of substance back in there. But I would like to have just a hint of some phthalo blue in there. It's going to be tough to make this happen because it's probably just going to turn green or yellow, but I'm going to try. I'll try and look for a place where the paper is relatively untouched. And if it doesn't take, and sometimes it doesn't, I might come back later in the painting and maybe use some opaque color, maybe a cerulean blue or something like that, and put a little bit of that in there. And then again, another flash of the Quin Gold with almost pure pigment. And I'll do the same process when this gets a little bit drier. I'll probably drop some clear water in there to hopefully get some action going. This combination of green gold with the raw umber and a little bit of the sepia, I really like that green. It's still pretty bright, but it's not nearly as gaudy as it was. Gaudy is not really a word we want to hear probably in association with our work. I'm going to sit and watch this for a while, and when it gets to that perfect stage, I'm going to drop a little bit of clear water into this, maybe get a little more action going, hopefully. Then we'll be ready to take off all the masking fluid and start in on the fish. I'm going to start in on this fish here, and I want to do it wet and wet so I get a nice natural look and some diffusion to the paint, but I don't want it to get into the other fish because I'm going to make them all a little bit of a different color. I'm going to just wet this fish. It's a little bit too wet to start painting in right now, so I'm just going to hold off for a couple minutes and let the paper get damp. Okay, I've waited until this got to not the dull sheen stage, but just the damp stage where it feels cold when I touch it. And I'm going with the Quin Gold here, or Nickel Azo Gold. I keep forgetting to give it the current name. And this becomes a little bit of a tense thing because it's a race against time. How wet the paper is, how much spreading starts to happen, how dry the paper is, how much spreading isn't happening. And of course I'm trying to preserve some of these little white areas, and if it spreads too much, they start closing up, so I got to do some blotting for that. I didn't wet this fin over here because if I did that, the paint that I just put in here would start fading into there and we'd lose the definition of this edge of the body of the fish. So I'll get to the other fin later. This one's different. This has all been wetted because I want some of this color to fade down into there, but I want to make sure that this edge stays defined because that's what's separating this fish from the one above him. And if it starts drying up, I'll just hit it with the spray bottle. But right now it's just about perfect. And I don't care if some parts are a little darker than others, that just makes it look more natural, I think. And again, as long as the paper is wet and the paint is wet, you've got some margin for error. I expect it to bleed a little bit beyond these lines. That's what I want it to do. But I don't want it to go all the way, and for instance, I don't want it to close that little hole up, so I'll be watching that. Actually, I'm kind of watching everything while I do this. Always have to watch having it cover up this fin. I want to keep that little white area going through there. That helps sort of define the curve of the body of the fish. And you see it's starting to close up now. So I'll blot that a little bit, and I'll be doing that a lot with various areas. And I don't want to do this type of painting. I'm not going to do a smooth stroke where I follow it like that. That usually doesn't look good to me. I do this sort of thing where I kind of just dab it down there. That seems to encourage the paint to do stuff that looks more natural to me. And I want some of it to get down into this fin, so I'll wet that. Okay, the paper's a little bit too dry over here, so I'm going to give it a quick shot with the spray bottle, which just totally messed that up. And if something gets screwed up, I just make a new spot on the fish. Spread a little more than I wanted it to there, which leaves these little stains around there, but that ends up looking good, so I'm not concerned about that. Again, it's best, I think, if you're just not too careful with it. And I like some of it to bleed into this fin, this big fin along the back, but not too much. And I've got kind of a hard edge here because the paper was kind of dry, so I'll hit that. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and drop a little clear water in here now to get more of those little blooms and crawlbacks. Got to be careful about doing that too close to the edge of any of these spots because it could make them spread more than I want them to. And of course, these things actually have scales on them, but I usually don't bother to paint them. For one thing, a painting this size is likely to be viewed from a distance, and little finicky type details sometimes work against you instead of for you. I'm thinking as long as it looks good from 15, 20 feet away, but I still like to have enough interesting stuff going on with it so that it holds up to close inspection. I can be a little sloppier with the water back here because if it bleeds off the fish, it's just going to go into this background. That'll be easy to blot up. I just really had to be careful that it didn't work itself into the other fish here. This has bled out a little bit more than I wanted it to, but I'll just blot some of that up. And actually these little stains that result from that just enhance the final effect to me. And as I say, if there's something about the fish that I don't like, I just change it. So you can't expect that every fish is necessarily going to agree with your ideas of design and composition. So if the spots on the fish aren't really arranged that artistically, I change them. So don't be a slave to your reference photos. If you don't like something, change it. So I've got this little area over here to do. Boy, the paper is just about perfect right there. And again, you see this guy always closes up, but it's not too bad. And even if it does close up, there's a few ways of fixing that. Okay, so I'm just going to watch this for the next few minutes and make sure none of these areas close up on me and make sure that this fin doesn't disappear on me. And then we'll get to the next one. I wet fish number 2, and I've waited until it's really just to the damp stage. I'm going to make this guy red. So I've squeezed out a little bit of quinacridone red, some quin burnt orange, and some raw umber. The quin red by itself would just be too pink, too wild. Quin orange isn't quite what I want, but in combination with the quin red, I like it. And if any of it starts looking really bright or really garish or really ridiculous, then I'll tone it down with the raw umber. And I think I'll start in a safe place just to see if I've gauged the wetness of the paper correctly. And I'm using a smaller brush because I've got some more complex patterns in here. It's going to be a little bit tougher to make some of these little turns and some of these little jags. It was simpler on this one. So I've gone to that number 6 brush. And remember, I'm trying to keep this line defined because that's the one that separates these two fish. And as with the other section, I'm going to have to keep an eye on things to make sure it doesn't start closing up some of these gaps too much. I don't really like doing this much painting with the small brush because it takes too long, but it's the only way I can really be accurate. And I can feel the paper starting to dry up a little bit on me. It's not too bad right in this area, but by the time I start going over to the other side, it's going to be too dry, so I'll have to spray that area again. Might be a good idea to do it now, ahead of time. There's some other little gaps that occurred just because that part of the paper was dry and I haven't covered it with paint. So I think I'll actually keep those there because if these close up, I want to keep some little air holes in here. I want to preserve some of the whites. And the paper has really gotten dry right in here. So before that hard edge sets, I like this combination of colors because you're not really sure if it's red or if it's orange or brown or something in between. I've actually painted past one of these lines here, which was my intended design for the spots on this fish, but it's not a big deal. I can work with that. But I really don't want this red part to totally surround both of these little, whatever they are. I don't know if they're whiskers or what. I don't know if that's the correct term for koi fish, but whatever these two little things are that hang off there, I don't want them both completely surrounded by the red. I think it's more interesting if at least one of them is just partially surrounded by the red. And originally I had a line drawn back here, and I guess I just totally blew that off and kept painting. Not a big deal. But the paper's pretty dry over here, so to get that to spread a little bit, or to get that to spread a lot, I had to stop because I wanted to make sure I was controlling the bleeding that was going on over here. And the paper dried up on me over here, so I had to re-wet that again. So this is not an exact science. Not going to do exactly what you want it to. But sometimes it ends up doing something better than what you envisioned. And if you just take on that detached attitude that I keep bragging about, you'll be okay. A little bit too much into that fin. I want it to bleed a little bit into the fin because that looks good. That looks natural. Not too much. And what's too much? Well, I don't know. Too much for me might be not enough for you. Not enough for you might be too much for me. And I've probably done about as much on this area as I should and still be able to control everything that's going on around here. So I'm not going to go too much farther. I'm not going to be able to quite finish it in this pass. While I've got it on my mind, I'm going to drop some clear water into here, try and get some excitement going. Sometimes I flatten out the paper by spraying the back and putting it under a big piece of glass for a while to flatten it out. And I suppose that does make some of this easier because I've got some little hills and valleys here, but sometimes I think it enhances the look because some of it flows down into these little areas and I think it looks good. The paint and the paper and the water, the physics of the whole shebang wants to do some things on its own, and I'm a little bit reluctant to argue with it too much. A lot of this has to do with controlling it, but I don't want to over-control it. All right, I think that's about all I can do for the time being. I just have to watch this for a few minutes, blot the stuff I don't like, and then I'll wet the rest of it. I don't have too much further to go, but I don't want to chance anything too wrong going on here. I stopped going any further here and went back and made sure nothing disastrous happened here. And I'm actually really very happy with the colors in here. We've got some of the brown, some of the pink, some of the orange. And I came in here and did a little bit between these fins. And now I've just re-wet the rear part of the fish here. And I've just got a little bit more to do in here. Do a little blotting here. I can actually see this faint pencil line in here and go back and sort of reestablish as closely as possible that original shape that I wanted. Since I've got so little area here to worry about, I ought to be able to finish this off and do the blotting and even enjoy myself a little bit, hopefully. This area is actually sort of the ideal wetness. Pretty much stayed where I put it, but it's starting, those little tentacles, those little dendrites or whatever you want to think of them as, are starting to spread out a little bit. So just coming down the home stretch on this baby. And now I just want to drop a little clear water in here, hopefully make something happen. And it is happening. One more fish to go. I'm going to use the Quin Gold again on this one, but this is actually going to end up being a different color than this one. I did the Quin Gold here too as an underpainting, but then I'm going to change this into sort of a different tone that's not going to look so much like Quin Gold. Whereas this fish, I really want it to be sort of a pure Quin Gold, but a lot deeper than this one. So while these two will look sort of alike at this stage, they are going to end up looking substantially different. And again, I've wet the whole fish here, and I've waited until the paper is hopefully just the right dampness. And you'll see that I'm going in with a heavier mixture of the paint than I did on the other one, which actually, along with the paper being a little bit drier up on this one, will inhibit some of the spreading of the paint. So I'll probably have to hit it with the spray bottle a little more than I did on the others. But of course this makes it easier for me to follow my design for the spots. But I'm going heavy enough with the paint that if I feel like it's starting to dry up on me, I'm going to be very careful, because this much paint I would have a lot of trouble spraying away or blotting if it starts doing something I don't like. So I don't want to go too much farther here before I hit it with the spray bottle to get a little more diffusion. When the spray bottle's just been sitting there for a while, sometimes you'll pull the trigger and it doesn't really do anything, or it just dribbles out, or it gives you a weird spray. So I always like to give it a test shot first. And you'll see I got a lot of overspray from that, but that's okay. It's also tempting to turn the paper around maybe and do this sideways. It'd be easier to reach, or upside down. But I found that painting stuff upside down is a little bit tricky. I feel like I need to be seeing it right side up, which is the way it's going to be in the final painting, while I'm doing it. Or sometimes I tend to start doing strange things. If it's an area that's not very important, if it's just a matter of blocking in some basic colors somewhere, then it's not a big deal painting upside down. But if it's something that's kind of critical, I like to be painting right side up because my sense of composition and design, pretty much my sense of everything, is a lot more reliable from this vantage point. As you can probably see, this area of the paper here is pretty dry. I definitely need to give this a shot with the spray bottle right now before those hard, smooth edges set. This is just at the stage where I want to drop in the clear water. I can let this area go now. It's pretty dry. I did some blotting to make sure nothing closed up, and I've re-wet the paper. I'm going to finish this one off. About done with that. A couple darker accents in here, a couple places, and then the old clear water trick. So I'll keep an eye on this for a few minutes and blot out anything that's not cooperating, and we'll move on to the next stage. I'm going to go back into fish number 1 to deepen the color a little bit, and I'm mixing up some sepia in just a straight watercolor along with the Quin Gold, which is the fluid acrylic. Gives me a really nice, deep, warm, golden yellow that's going to look nice on this Quin Gold underpainting. I'm doing this wet and wet because I still want things to fuse and spread. So fish number 1, this guy, he looked pretty close to fish number 3 since they were both Quin Gold, although different values of it. And I don't want them that similar, so this is going to be kind of the golden brown one. And I don't want to apply it evenly. I want that mottled sort of uneven look. This stage is easier because these spots and the design were already established the first time. And now I've got a much more obvious guide to work with. And notice I'm going a little bit inside of where the first layer spread. And when I hit this with the spray bottle to make it diffuse a little bit more, it's easier for me to control what goes on here. As long as it doesn't really spread beyond where the first layer spread, I feel pretty safe. And I pre-wet the paper right here around this fin, and this time avoided the fin so that it wouldn't bleed into that and cover it up completely. And I'm using more Quin Gold than I am sepia. So I'll continue this with the other sections, and I'm going to stop for a moment, watch it for a few minutes, and let it get a little bit drier, and then drop the clear water in again. Then I'll get into these last parts. This looks like it's just about right for dropping some water in here. You can see I added a few more accents of the sepia, the darker spots. I want to get as much of this mottled appearance as I can. And you see it's running around here, but I like that. I want that to happen. And since I'm not going to bother painting scales, the more of this texture stuff that happens, I figure the better. And this is one of those colors that if you just looked at it for a second and turned away and someone asked you, what color was that? You'd probably get a few different answers. It looks a little bit yellow, it's a little brown, it's a little orange. It's kind of all three. I don't want to disturb that, so I'm going to let that dry before I finish it off here. I'm pretty happy with this now. I like the color, and I like the variation in it, and all the modeling, all the blooms and crawbacks and blossoms cooperated. Also, remember earlier when I did the first layer how this white fin started closing up on me, and I kept blotting that, but some of the paint covered it up. Now you see it's not a big deal because the darker value layer defined the edge of that, and actually the stuff that bled into there looks good now. It makes it more natural looking. So you see that little thing that may have appeared to be a disaster early on ended up being something good. On fish number 2, I'm going to go back in with the same colors but just deepen them. Down the road a little bit, I will be introducing the colors of each fish into the other ones, just to sort of tie them all together. I've got to be careful about making the red fish too brilliant because, you know, red is sort of a color that attracts your eye to begin with, and I don't want it to steal the whole show or get, you know, so bright that you just can't concentrate on anything else. But I definitely want little areas that are super bright. The painting right now is in what I think of as the ugly stage, because the fish still look like they're sort of pasted on. They don't really have any connection with the water, and I've got some things to do to achieve that. And this is where it's common for a lot of people to lose some patience and do something that they shouldn't do. But I just try and maintain that detached attitude because I know that it's going to change pretty soon. For the third one here, it's actually pretty much what I want there color-wise, but it's a little bit too bright. So I'm going to use some raw umber and dull that down a little bit. Always easier to go that direction than the other direction. Wet in wet, once again, or maybe I should say wet into damp. The first layer on this fish was just pure Quinn gold, and although there's a lot of variation in it value-wise, no variation in it color-wise, so the raw umber is going to make it a little bit more interesting, I hope. But I don't want to get it too close to the first one. The first one should be more yellowish gold, and this one should be more orangish gold, and I think that's the neighborhood I'm in. Since this is a pretty light coat of paint, when I drop the water in this time, it's not going to do that much, but I'll give it a shot anyway. So I'll watch this for a little while, drop some clear water into that, and get to the next stage. What I want to do is introduce a little bit of each color into each fish. I want to get a little bit of the red into this fish. So I'm going to use the Quinn red. Actually, it's not going to come out red, but more pink, and that's what I want. I like to work some pink into a lot of my paintings if possible. There's something about that color that just seems to work for me, and it won't be this strong. It's going to all dissipate. I can encourage it to do that. Now that, to me, just made this 100 times more interesting. At first glance, it appears to be this sort of tobacco stain, yellow, orange, brown tone, and then you look a little closer and there's a surprise in there. It's like, oh, there's a little pink in there. And I don't know if it's really trying to represent the fact that it's actually in the fish, or that maybe it's some sort of reflection going on from somewhere in this pond or from the fish that's next to it. It adds just enough surprise that, for me, it makes this fish quite a bit more interesting. It's also something that, like all the techniques we've talked about, is easy to overdo, so you're probably better off doing not quite enough than too much. Then on this one, I want to get some yellowish orange going in here, so Quinn Gold is the perfect color for that, because this is not a color that I used in this fish. To me, that just made this fish about 10 times more interesting, and it really connects it to this one. Again, it could be a color that's actually naturally occurring in this fish, or more likely some reflection from something in this pond. This one actually already has the Quinn Gold. It's got a lot of the brown. I'm debating whether I really want to put any red in there or not. I guess I'll just put a couple little touches so I can say I did it. And that's probably enough. I really want it to be understated on this one. I dry it completely in between each stage just to make sure that when I re-wet and do all this kind of stuff that I don't move the paint. And of course this little move that I'm doing here with the big brush, you really could not be doing that with pure watercolor, or you would be erasing probably half your painting. So that's another reason I like to use the acrylic in a lot of work, because I can keep re-wetting the painting. Sometimes when a painting starts to look dull, just because, you know, the paint dries, it's not as vibrant and not as bright looking as when it's wet, I'll just wet the whole thing to get some idea of what it's going to look like when it's under glass. So I'm constantly wetting paintings, except the ones where I'm using pure watercolor. I'm a lot more careful about it there. And I'm going to mix up a combination of raw sienna, and this actually is a pure watercolor paint, some ultramarine blue, which is acrylic, golden fluid, and some alizarin crimson. Actually, alizarin crimson hue, because pure alizarin crimson, of course, is a fugitive color, and I don't think people are using it too much anymore. And start getting rid of some of this bright white. I'm not going to do it with all the white because I want some little bright white parts to pop out. Just the way I did with the color in the fish. I didn't want to dull everything down. I wanted some little bits of bright color to pop out. You know, this bright orange, this quin gold here, some of the bright pink and the reds and the orange and yellow in there. Pretty much the whole rest of the painting will be devoted to fixing these hard edges in kind of an interesting way. And at any point that I feel, you know, I'm covering up too much of anything, a little shot with the spray bottle. It also, depending on how you use it, can create kind of a neat little texture that you see going on in here. I don't know if it'll stay that way, but anytime you spray water on wet paint or damp paint, you get an effect that, actually it's a little bit similar to using salt, but I like it better than salt. I don't use salt on paintings because it's a trick that everybody knows, and you can tell from a mile away that, oh, somebody dumped salt on there. I've used it, I guess, occasionally when you want that little sort of starburst pattern on there, but I find you can get the same effect just using water, and it's a more natural looking effect because you can just tell, you know, what happened with water. It almost looks like something that's been left out in the rain, and raindrops have kind of pounded it and made this little mottled pattern. So I love that right there. I don't know if it's necessarily going to stay like that. I'd be happy if it did. I'm going to blot out some of this stuff I've done in a few places where I really want it to stay sort of bright white. I'm pretty happy with that. All right, I dried that, and I'm pleased because that little mottled pattern, or that little sort of granulation that happened in the paint, preserved that, and it knocked back the bright whites, which was the main purpose, but it also started to at least get the fish sort of in the ballpark of being in the water, even though we still have this hard edge. The next step involves using the toothbrush, which is probably the watercolorist's best friend next to the spray bottle and the hair dryer. And what I'm going to do is mix up some raw umber and some ultramarine blue, which makes one of those colors, sort of a grayish, brownish blue. Actually one of those colors where you can't always really tell quite what it is. And I don't want it too watery, then it'll come out in a spray, and then all the little dots, all the little bits will start to converge, and it won't look as though I've done anything with a toothbrush. I don't want it too dry though either, so it's something that probably is worth some experimentation in your studio on some scrap paper. And I'm going to go around the edges of the fish, and it'll accomplish a couple things. First of all, it'll start to camouflage the edge. I mean, it's not going to do that a lot, but it'll do it a little bit. It'll help. It'll add some interesting texture to the fish, a texture that we don't have yet anywhere in the painting, this fine spray, these tiny little dots. And it'll also begin to model the fish a little bit. It'll increase the sense of roundness and form. You should probably practice that on your palette or a scrap piece of paper to begin with to see how it's going to come off there. And it's so fine, you might even get the idea that it's not really doing all that much. But you'd be amazed after you've done this and you step back from the painting, what an effect it has. Not quite enough is probably better than too much, because you can always go over it again. I also am careful not to do it the same way in each part of every edge of each fish. So you notice here I didn't do quite as much right in this area. It's a little heavier here. I tend to go a little heavier where things intersect. It sort of seems to mimic the idea of maybe a shadow or some overlap or some little nook or cranny in there that's probably going to be shrouded in some shadow. So I go a little heavier there. But this is way too hard and way too defined for my taste right now, but that's going to change. It would probably be good to have toothbrushes of various sizes. I just sort of go with the one size and try to make the adjustment in how thick or thin the paint is and how far back I bend the bristles. I'm going to stay away a little bit from this dorsal fin. I'll put a few in there. But that, of course, is sort of sticking up from the body of the fish, so that's not really something that I want rounded. It's the body of the fish that I want to model. And then just so it doesn't look as though I've only done it around the edges, I'll add a little bit in other places. And I don't really ever like to do the whole thing in one shot without checking it out, so I'll stop there and look at it for a while and decide if that's enough. But already it's created some shadowing around the edges of the fish, and I think it's improved it. I want to make sure the paper is just damp. Well, right now it's sort of the dull sheen stage, but I can sort of get rid of some of that with the big brush. And I want to have a few little mixtures of paint here ready to go. So remember that phthalo blue and raw sienna makes that nice greenish turquoise that I like a lot. And I want to have some of the ultramarine blue and purple going. Remember that was mostly ultramarine blue with just a touch of the purple. And then we've got some sort of grayish tones happening in there in the water, so I think I'll probably do that with the ultramarine blue and a little bit of the burnt umber. And as I've been doing that, I think this has gotten just about to where I want it. Just make sure again. And this looks pretty awful while I'm doing it, but bear with me. Just going to paint around all the edges, not too carefully, as you can see. And it would be nice to sort of approximate the color of the background as I go, but I mean, it's not a big deal as long as I'm in the ballpark. I probably won't be able to do all the edges of each fish. Maybe I'll get around to the top of this one. This will help obscure the tail of the fish. I had some nice phthalo sort of turquoise stuff going in there, so I want to match that up. That's all I'm going to do just for the moment. So I hit it with the spray bottle quickly, and then do a little tilting. Probably better to err on the side of a little bit too wet, which means I'll lose some of the effects, but I can go back and do it again. It's kind of nice to get a little direction going. You see how this is starting to run over there, and that's exactly what I want. You see, this is kind of working its magic, and it's created kind of a glow around the edges of the fish. And it's brought some of the water in around them. Okay, I could probably finish this off, but I don't really want to take the chance. I want to watch this for a few minutes. I let the blue stripe around the fish dry. I want to be careful about that in case it did anything strange, so I watched it for a while. And I'm going to finish it off, so I've wet the paper again, but I have to sort of adjust the color a little bit as I move up around here. I'm going to move the paper around and keep going here. Another one of those things that you want to do sort of quickly for a couple reasons. You don't want to look too careful, and also because as you're doing it, the paper is drying, which means the paint is drying, and I can't say it enough. Once it's dry, there's nothing you can really do if you want to change something. And remember, we're not really trying to hide that edge completely. That's impossible to do. You're never going to get rid of it completely. But we're just trying to distract the eye and get this little sort of glow around the fish and into the fish. And then some tilting. This kind of thing is not a disaster. I sort of like it when that happens. If it happens too much, I'll just blot it out. I wanted to be careful up here. There's less margin for error because the values of the water are lighter, and if I do something weird or too dark, too much paint or whatever, it's going to stand out more. I'm going to let this dry out a little bit, and then I'll come back and touch it up. I'm also going to do a little bit along the edge of the fish here. You see I did a little bit around the nose and around this fin. So I'll just touch up a few areas, and then we'll get on to the next stage. I'm using raw umber and ultramarine blue just to make a gray. Most people make these too dark, I've noticed, when people do this kind of painting in my workshops. So definitely better to err on the side of too light, and then you can go back and fix them. But if you've gone too dark, hard to do anything about that. And then I like to make part of it a little darker than the rest. So if you can see this area right here, it's just sort of a light to medium value layer of color, but I might touch one part of it just to make it a little more interesting. I don't want to make them too smooth or too perfect. Good enough for right now. Anytime you add something completely new to the painting, it always looks a little bit strange to you right at first. And it's like, oh, because you've been looking at it for hours the old way. But then you get used to it. And of course, they do have to have eyes. I need to get some real quality darks in here. I'm going to do that again around the edges of the fish, which is going to do an even better job of sort of stitching them into the rest of the painting. So I want to add some of those darks also into the bamboo to make that pop from the background. And I'll begin in the same place as I did the little wet in wet bits and sort of accentuate those. And it makes an enormous difference in the painting, and it really gets us coming down the home stretch here. I'm going to do that, not really wet in wet, but oh, this is great. My spray bottle is starting to bomb out on me already. This is very common with spray bottles. You know, some artists go through brushes, some artists go through hair dryers, some artists go through husbands and wives. I go through spray bottles. I think we're going to cut for a minute because I got to get this wet. I'm not just going to paint a stripe around here, sort of the way I did with the blue. I'm going to do what I call the sewing machine stroke. And it's a matter of sort of tapping down on the edge with just the point of the brush, and it sort of drops down. I keep saying sort of. It doesn't sort of do this. It actually puts almost pure pigment around these edges. And I don't do all the edges. In fact, I purposely skip some areas, just sort of go by feel and intuition, because I found I don't have to do every bit of the edge. In fact, if you want to start doing this yourselves, what I would suggest is that you begin in the darkest areas of the edge to begin with. Let's say I wouldn't start it here, over here on this fish, that's pretty light, but on this fish I would maybe begin right in there. And what this does is it covers that hard edge a little bit, but then doing this on the wet paper, the paint sort of radiates a little bit, and it flows a little bit into the fish, flows a little bit into the water, so it integrates those two elements pretty well. But the main thing it does is it gives us a real dark in here that makes everything pop. Again, I don't do it everywhere, just enough to make the suggestion, and the eye fills in the rest of it. And then these parts where the body crosses over, say this little fin, a couple little dark dots in there. That's just enough to describe that. I'll do that along here also. But I've gone far enough here where I probably need to step back and see how it's going. And it flowed a little bit too much in here. I probably got that too wet, so I'm going to blot some of that. I'll just kind of check this out for a minute, and you see that it's really making that fish stand out in one sense, but in another way, it's integrating it even more with the background. I'm just going to start in the areas where I did those dark little accents in the earlier stage, and I'll constantly check what I'm doing by standing up and getting away from it. Maybe I'll put the painting on the floor. I'm not going to do it everywhere, but I will start in the areas that already are sort of dark. That seems to be the most natural looking thing. Thank goodness I don't have to do this everywhere, because that really would be tedious. That'd be about as tedious as the masking fluid. And so that it doesn't appear too much as a line, I'll keep hitting. I've got a new spray bottle working here. And you see already it's made this little area really pop out from the background. And that's what I'm trying to do here. And I might even place a few accents maybe somewhere in the middle of a leaf, so it's not all around the edges of the green, but also inside of one of the leaves. Paper is fairly buckled here, but it doesn't really matter. I just don't want it to get too dry. I want to keep that wet in wet look. That's the look that people associate with loose, free painting. Though it's probably pretty obvious by now that this painting really had a lot of thought put into it, and I'm just trying to make it appear as though it were dashed off. So for you tight, realistic painters who've got that desire to paint looser and more spontaneously, but just can't do it, and there are people like that, just as there are people who paint loosely and just cannot paint tighter no matter what. Some of these techniques I've demonstrated here will hopefully give you some ideas about at least making your work appear loose. I don't paint all my paintings this way, of course, but I do like to use these little accents because they sort of give the viewer's eye little places to sort of latch onto so that they don't get lost when looking at the painting. And if you've got a big painting with big expanses of color and big shapes, sometimes people aren't really sure where to look. Well, I mean, hopefully you've established that with a strong center of interest, but again, if you've got a really big painting going, their eyes start wandering around all over the place, and these little accents give the eye something solid to hang on to. I don't want to do any more without standing back and looking at it, so I'm going to stop for a few minutes. I finished doing the little dark accents around all the bamboo, and you can see it's really made that come alive. One thing worth pointing out is that when I did those original little dark parts, wet and wet, when the masking fluid was on, none of it got into the bamboo leaves, of course, because they were masked. So the paint just diffused this way out into the background, which softened things going that direction, but not into the leaves themselves. So now that the masking fluid was off, when I added these other little dark accents with that sewing machine stroke, they radiated both ways. They diffused outwards into the background and into the leaf a little bit, so it really did soften these edges somewhat. And I didn't have to do it everywhere, I just did it here and there enough to create the effect. I think the viewer's eye probably sort of fills in the rest. Also notice that I didn't do the masking fluid perfectly here. It's almost impossible to do that. So there's some tiny white edges and gaps alongside the leaves, and I like those. They add a little bit of sparkle to the painting and let it breathe a little bit so the whole thing isn't closed in with paint, and I would never fill those in. I like to keep those. Since I've got these little black dots everywhere, I kind of wanted to get a little bit of that same thing going in the water. And I'm going to use some Payne's Gray, which a lot of people have something against. It sort of has a bad rap in the watercolor world, but I like it a lot. I don't use it straight too often. I usually mix it. And I don't use it normally in large areas, but I think it's a great color. And I'm mixing some of that with the raw umber. Get a really nice dark, and I'm just going to touch down in a few places and then hit it with the spray bottle, just so all this little dark dot business isn't happening only in the fish and in the bamboo. And if I don't like one of them or like how it's spread out, I'll just blot it out, but I think I'll stick with that. Later on, towards the end, if it feels like it needs another one somewhere up here, I might go for that. One thing to remember is that whatever is behind the subject is also in front of the subject. We've got water behind or under the fish, so I think some water needs to be on top of the fish also, or in front of the fish. This will sort of unify the whole painting and give it even more of an undulating look. So I've got ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, and some phthalo blue. And I'm going to mix up something that's sort of a combination between the three. And also I think I'll add a little bit of raw sienna here. I'm going to use my 2-inch brush. Get a nice juicy mixture going here. And paint some big, ghastly, ugly stripes across the fish. I wasn't too crazy about how that little stem came right into that leaf, so I'm going to do something to distract from that. I don't really want any pure pigment on here, I just want a kind of a juicy wash. The pure pigment could have a chance to set, and I don't want that to happen. And I'm not covering the whole fish. I'm sort of doing this striped motif. I'll do a little bit of it across the bamboo. Looks pretty horrible right now. Most people just don't have the nerve to do this, but I figure it's only paint, it's only paper. The spray bottle goes into action. Need to disperse these stripes a bit. This would be a bad time to have the spray bottle bomb out on you. It would probably be about the worst time. And it really ties the whole painting together. It makes the fish look like they really are underwater, and it ends up tinting some of the colors in a way that we get some new colors we haven't had up to this point. And the next step is to blot a lot of this where I don't want it. I want to preserve some of those whites. And if the paper towel doesn't do it, and sometimes it doesn't, sometimes the paper towel just can sort of push the pigment back into the paper. So the spray bottle is a better way of removing it where you don't want it, and you will go through a fair amount of paper towels doing this. Now, of course, I've obliterated some of those stripes, and where I feel like I want to get them back in there, I'll add a few of these deals. But the main thing I want to do is make sure that I've preserved some of these clean, or relatively clean, whites. I feel like the fish are much better integrated with the background now, and it's given us some new variations in the color. After it dries, if I decide that some of the colors, say this red, has been tinted too much, I might go back in wet and sort of recharge it with some bright color, maybe to jazz it up again. But as long as some of these little bright parts pop out, that's really what I'm after. I think there'll be enough in there. I think I'll stop right there and just sort of watch it for a while and make sure the whites that I do have don't disappear on me. I removed the masking fluid that I spattered on there way back in the beginning. Some of them aren't white because when I took off other masking fluid layers, I inadvertently removed some of those, but that's okay. They got tinted with some paint and they look good to me. Again, I do this as a safety mechanism. If the painting would have gotten claustrophobic and too dense and too dark, being able to have these come back later towards the end allows the painting to breathe again and gives it some sparkle. And if there's too many of them or I don't like the way they look, then you can just fill them in. I'm not going to fill them all in, but I'm going to fill a few of them in with just some clean phthalo blue, so I'll get a different look there. And a few little bright colors. I've got some Quin red here, Quin gold, and green gold. And this part's fun. It's like you're adding little jewels to the painting. And there'd be no way to get these afterwards on top of the dark paint, of course, at least not transparently. It's the kind of thing that you can't really see, of course, clearly from far away, but you sort of sense that it's there. The eye somehow knows that there's something going on there. It's not just the water and not just white spatter or sparkle, but something a little different. That might be reason for somebody to come in for a closer view, just to see what's going on here. Okay, I think that's enough of that. Again, it's fun to do, but you don't want to overdo it. In these big expanses of color here, it's sort of easy for the eye to get lost. Dark spatter zooms the eye in on these little focal points. It's also a good way if you've had a problem in a painting or made a mistake or you've got something that you're not too happy with, then adding a little bit of dark spatter, like just one little black dot or one little dark dot in that area, the eye tends to look at that dot and not what's going on around it. You can fix a lot of mistakes with that, or at least distract from them. And I've mixed up some raw umber and ultramarine blue. It's a pretty dark color. It's probably something that most people should be practicing first just to see what kind of spatter is going to come off the brush. You should have paper towel ready to go in case some of it goes where you don't want it to, and you can blot it up. This is again something that is very easy to overdo because it's kind of fun. It starts looking good right away and you start feeling like you're an artist. So I'm going to start over this guy here. Those little black dots there suddenly make that white part sort of come alive. I wouldn't mind having a couple slightly larger ones, and with this brush, I'm probably not going to get them that big, so I'll just touch down. That way I can get a bigger one happening. I don't want to do it too hard, and I don't want to get any direction going. You know, that's another type of spatter that you can do where you sort of knock the brush and you get a directional thing going. I don't want that for this. I just want the sort of dots that come straight down. And if a few of them get into the background, that's probably a good idea, so they're not all in the fish. A couple bigger ones here. A safe place to do this, some of these larger ones, if you're unsure of yourself, might be where some of these darker accents were put to begin with. It seems sort of logical that there'd be a little dark speck there and then something sort of radiated outwards from there. So if you're wondering where to place these bigger ones, that could guide you. The last thing I'm going to do is the exact same thing, but with some titanium white. And I would love to do this all day, but I'm going to stop myself right there. Time to sign the painting. I just use my first name, Nicholas, and I'll let this dry, and then we'll remove the masking tape and the masking fluid along the edge. That looks a lot better. The last step is to provide some documentation on the back of the painting. I used to just scrawl my name across there and the date, and whatever else came to mind. And then I finally got it in my head to have a rubber stamp made that basically tells people that I don't really want them reproducing the painting without my permission. The handle broke off about a zillion years ago. This is an original work and may not be reproduced without written consent of the artist, Nicholas E. Simmons. This painting is Koi Joy. It's been a series, and I believe this is number 35. The medium is really watercolor and acrylic watercolor, and the date is May of '07. I'm Nicholas Simmons. Do svidaniya.